Welcome to Excel Magic Trick number 1387. Hey, if you want to download this Excel workbook, Excel Magic Trick 1387 finished, or the start file so you can follow along, click on the link below the video. Hey, we got a great video here. We're going to try and create this frequency distribution pivot table with conditional formatting and a slicer. And we're going to base it on the big data that we saw how to import back in Excel Magic Trick 1385 and 86. In those two videos, we imported tables from an SQL Server database, and then we saw how to import and append a large text file. Now, those tables of data are in this workbook. But in this video, we want to see how to create DAX formulas, that is data analysis expressions, in the Power Pivot data model in order to build a frequency distribution by year and country. Now here's our end result. I'm in the finished workbook. I'm on the sheet frequency distribution by year and country. I have my pivot table with conditional formatting showing dark blue values as the largest, white values in the middle, and red as the smaller values. And I want to be able to slice this by selecting any country, for example, Canada, and instantly have my frequency distribution update. Australia, Fiji, or completely unfiltered. All right, I'm going to close the finished file. Now over here in the start file, I want to take a look at the data we already imported. And if you download this start file, it has all of the tables that we imported from earlier videos. So I'm going to click Data Ribbon tab, Get and Transform is Power Query, Show Queries. There's our F transactions. That originally was 7.7 million rows imported from an SQL Server database. We imported a text file and appended it to the bottom here to get 8.7 million records. Then we have a lookup table for product and country. So that's the data we're starting with. And here's the steps we're going to need to do in this video. We're going to build a count category table in Excel. Now, we need to do that because unlike a normal pivot table where we have a grouping feature, that's not in Power Pivot. So we have to somehow simulate that grouping feature. Now, these are categories, and the category is how many transactions for a given year and country had a quantity between 1 and 12. The next category here is how many transactions had quantities between 13 and 24, and so on. So we're going to create this category that we can drop into the row area of a pivot table. So we're going to create that table in Excel, then import it. I'm going to close this query window. Then we're going to create an automatic dCalendar table in Power Pivot because we're going to need that to get our years. Then we're going to build a DAX calculated column in the fact table to use in the relationship between the fact table and the count category. Then we'll build relationships between tables. We'll build our DAX measure for our frequency formula. Then we'll build our pivot table based on the data model. Add our conditional formatting to the pivot table, add a slicer, and some formatting. All right, so step number one, we're going to go to the sheet Count Categories. And on this sheet, we're going to create our Excel table with those categories. Now, for each category, we're going to need the lower and upper. So here we need 1 to 12, 13 to 24, and so on. So for the upper, I'm going to build a formula equals whatever the increment that we enter over here is. And I'm going to use the F4 key to lock that. Now notice I'm going to need 12, 24, 36. So I need to multiply this by some number incrementer that will give me 1, 2, 3 as I copy down. So we use the rows function. Now I need an expandable range here so rows can count how many rows there are in the range as we copy down. I'm sitting in cell C2, so I'm going to type $2 colon. Now, if we were not in an Excel table, we would simply type C2. Notice that 2 is locked, but that 2 is not. Right now, rows says how many rows are there from 2 to 2? There's only 1. But that 2 will turn to 3, 4, 5 as we copy down, And rows will give us 1, 2, 3 as we copy down. But guess what? The Excel table feature does not handle this kind of expandable range. But there's a great substitute. Instead of using a normal cell reference, I'm going to use the table formula nomenclature to get at that C2 as a relative cell reference. Now, in table formula nomenclatures, field names are always in square brackets. And I would simply like to say, please give me the upper tab and then close square bracket. Unfortunately, this is not a DAX calculated column where it would understand that it should get the current row. But over here in an Excel table, we indicate that we want whatever's in the upper column from the current row by using an @ symbol. And so that's how we're going to use a relative cell reference, which really means the formula is looking at the cell itself. And actually, there's very few formulas in Excel that don't give you a circular reference when you do this. But for an expandable range, it works fine. Now I'm going to Control-Enter. And that little blue boomerang shape there, I'm going to hover my cursor. And when I see my diagonal black arrow, I can click and drag. Now I'm going to go to a particular cell and hit F2. Notice it says C2 locked and the current row upper. So what rows really sees is C2, C3, C4. So it's counting from 2 to 4. Thus, it gets 3 times 12 is 36. So that formula will work all the way down. All right, for our lower, I don't want a single formula and then a different formula here. So in the very top cell, I need 1. Then I need 13. So I'm going to say, please, equal sign, right arrow. There's my relative cell reference for whatever's in the current row for upper. But I'm going to subtract the increment over here, F4. That gives me 12 minus 12 for this row, so I need to add 1 back in. Control-Enter, or just Enter, to populate all the way down. And there are our upper and lower, 13, 24, 25, and 36. Now we can create our category equals right arrow. That's our relative cell reference, 1 to the right. And I'm going to use the join symbol, ampersand, to join in double quotes, a space, dash, space, and double quotes, ampersand, arrow, arrow. And that will work all the way down. Notice we're getting whatever's in the current row for upper and whatever's in the current row for lower. When I hit Enter, there are our categories. Now I want to stop here, Control-S. I actually need to figure out what the max upper limit should be. So I'm going to use the data model and a DAX measure for just like a one-time calculation. Now we go to the Power Pivot Ribbon tab. Over to Data Model Manage. We can also, in the Data Ribbon tab, there's our Manage Data Model. The keyboard is Alt-ADM. Now I'm in the F transaction table. I'm going to pull this gray line up. And this is called the Measure Grid. And then we can click in any cell here and create a measure. It's a formula. And I'm just going to ask the question, what's the biggest value in the quantity? Now, when you're creating a measure, I'm going to start typing the name. I'll immediately jump up to the formula bar, max quantity. And since we're in Power Pivot and not Power BI Desktop, we have to type a colon and then an equal sign before we enter our max function. Now, the convention for referencing columns, no matter where you are in the data model, is you put the table name, F transactions, and then in square brackets, the particular field name or column name. So there it is, F transactions quantity. Close parentheses and Enter. And so we're using a DAX measure down in the measure grid just to see what the maximum value is, and it's 156. Alt-Tab. So I'm going to point to the lower right-hand corner, and when I see my diagonal black arrow, I click and drag. And there we go. So 145 to 156 will be our last category. Control-S. Now we need to import this into the data model, design, and I want to make sure that I have in properties a good name. CountCategories is the name of this table. Now I go over to Power Pivot. And in the tables group, there is Add to Data Model. I can see my table down here, count categories. If we go over to View, Diagram View, here's our F transaction. There's our count categories. We can move these around. We actually have one more table we need to create, and it's awesome in Power Pivot. There's an automatic button. If we go back to Data View and click on our F transactions table, there's an automatic button to create a calendar table. Now, if you're in Power BI Desktop, a few videos ago, I showed you how to do it with a table DAX formula. But we're in Power Pivot. I go over to Design, Calendars. There's our date table, and I say New. And it knows what to do. It went through and got a unique list from the min to the max. It gave us year, month number, month, and a bunch of other columns. Now I'm going to drag this over to the side. We do not have to do this, but you can if you want. Come over to Home, Formatting, click the drop down, and format this just as a date. Now for us, that year column is what we're going to drop into the column area as a condition or criteria for the interior frequency calculation. All right, now we can go back over to Diagram View. I'm going to drag the calendar over here. Now for our calendar table, we drag Date over to Date. And it's going to create a relationship, a one-to-many relationship. That means the first column over here has exactly one of each date in the min-max date range. So that's the one side. Over to the many sides, we can have many transactions for any particular day. Now this relationship is quite profound in the data model, either in Power Pivot or Power BI Desktop. If I filter down to a particular year, so 2014, or the measure inside the pivot table sees that column header 2014, this table is filtered down just to that one 2014, which means, and we can go look at that. See here, it would be filtered down just to these. So only these dates would be showing in that table. So this table is filtered, and that filter flows over to here and actually filters and shows only the records for those particular dates. Now that's important because with big data, that means the actual measure, the formula, is going to be calculating on a smaller table than all of the 8.7 million records. All right, now we're going to have to do the same thing for country. I'm going to click and drag over to country code. Now this relationship is similar. We have exactly one country code for each country over to we can have many transactions sold in each country. And what's important about this relationship is if we go look at our data view, D country. So our transaction data set, our fact table has these, but we would like to show these in our slicer. If we go over to our F transaction, we built a relationship. So now we don't have to show the abbreviation. We, through our relationship, can show the entire country name. Now I go over to Diagram View. Similarly for product, we don't have any either DAX calculated columns or measures or even criteria that we're going to use in this particular video. But I'm going to drag product over to product here. It's the one side to the many. We have one product with the price, cost, and the category. And of course, we can have many transactions sold for a particular product. Now, here's the one that we have to adjust. Count categories. There's nothing over here that we can build a relationship. Now, we don't have to build a relationship. We actually could build a formula that could deal with a disconnected table. But let's go look over in Data View at our count category. What we're going to do is we're going to, over in our fact table, in essence, code each transaction with the upper limit, either 12, 24, 36, 48. So if I go over to F transactions, I need a calculated column that will look at the quantity. 2 would be rounded up to 12. If I click the filter, you can see a unique list. So if I was at 34 quantity, it would need to round up to 36. Now, it's going to be a simple, straightforward formula, but this is 8.7 million records. If I add a calculated column here, it's going to add a new column to that database with supposedly 8.7 million records. But that's not the way the Columnar Database in Power Pivot and Power BI Desktop work. Anytime you have a column here, remember it's called Columnar Database, Column Database. Each one of these columns is stored as a separate unit, and only the unique list of items for each column is going to be showing. So really, if I add calculated column, and back over on count categories, there's only 13 unique possible items that are going to go in this new column here. So the Columnar Database will store an actual really small column with just those unique values in RAM memory. So that's what we're going to do. Now, how do we create a calculated column? Remember, we did a measure down here. And measures are items we can use down here in the measured grid or in the pivot table values area. And any measure will see the criteria coming from the pivot table row column area. Well, right here, we're going to build a calculated column. And this calculated column, it'll actually copy down, and it will automatically see each row in the data set, which means it'll automatically see each quantity for each transaction. All right, so here's how we create a calculated column. I'm going to double click and call this. Now, I called it something ridiculously big. I typed the name, upper limit quantity for a relationship. We'll actually hide this column so it doesn't show up in our pivot table field list. We'll just use it for the relationship. All right, and here's the formula. It's pretty easy. There's an equal sign. We're just going to use the ceiling function. Ceiling, I need to look at for each row in the data set quantity. So I type FT down arrow to get my table name and in square brackets field name. Now I type a comma. Significance, I'm going to always round up to the nearest 12. 12, 24, 36, and so on. Close parentheses and enter. And now one beautiful thing about all filters in any tool that we use in Microsoft products is if you click the filter, you'll see a unique list. And that, in essence, is a preview of what's being stored in the Columnar database. All right, now we have, in essence, codified each transaction with a multiple of 12. And now over in diagram view, we can use the upper value and click and drag over to upper limit quantity for relationship. Drag this down a little bit, and there it is. Now, of course, this is a 1 because there's one upper limit, multiple of 12. And over here, we can have many transactions that fit a particular counting category. Now, the next step we need to do is add a measure, which will be our frequency formula. Now, before we do that, I'm actually going to start our pivot table with year and category, and then come back and build a measure and talk about how the measure is going to work. All right, I'm going to click Pivot Table. On a new worksheet, click OK. Now, we can tell our tables are coming from the data model. That little black row at the top means from the data model. I'm going to go to Count Categories, and I'm going to drag my Count Categories over to the row area. Oh, no, that is messed up. That is sorted alphabetically. So we're going to go back over to the data model. Come over to Data View. We go to our Count Categories. And really, the data model and the pivot table obeyed us, right? It was actually sorting this alphabetically. There's a 1. There's a 1, 2. There's a 1, 3, 3, and so on. No problem. I'm going to click in this column. Come up to Home. Over to Sort by Column. And what if we told this column to automatically sort by the upper? Well, then, because this is a number, it would sort perfectly from smallest to biggest. And each row in the Count Category column will follow how this column is sorted. So I'm going to tell that column to sort that way. Sort by column. Count Categories is going to be sorted by which column. It doesn't matter which one. Either one will work. I'm going to use upper, click OK. Now, when we Alt-Tab to jump back over to our Excel spreadsheet, there it's sorted perfectly. Now I'm going to come over to dCalendar, uncheck more fields, and I'm going to take the year and click and drag down to columns. And there's the start of our pivot table. Now, a couple of things. I'm going to change the layout so we don't see column and row labels. Up to Design, Report Layout, Show, and Tabular. I'm going to come down to the sheet, double-click, and call this Frequency Distribution Quantity by Year and Country. All right, so we need a formula that in any intersecting cell will know to count only the quantity that was between 13 and 24 by this particular year. Later, we'll add that slicer. I'm going to go back over to the data model. And I'm going to go to Diagram View. So our goal is to count transactions. But that pivot table we just looked at, the intersecting cell, if the row area has count categories 13 to 24, that means this table is filtered down to the upper limit 24. That filter flows through the relationship, and the upper limit quantity for relationship column gets filtered down just to the number 24. So now the transaction data set is already much smaller. But there's another condition. The year for 2016, that will give us a list of dates in 2016. That filter flows across the relationship. And this table is further filtered down just with dates that are in 2016. Not only that, but later when we select a country, that filter will flow across here, filtering the transaction table down to a much smaller data set than that 8.7 million records. Now, that's one of the reasons that the data model and DAX formulas are so fast at calculating big data. This idea of filtering the data set down to a much smaller data set. If you come to Excel is Fun at YouTube often, you know I do a lot of videos on array formulas. And array formulas calculate on the whole column no matter what criteria we have. So data model, much faster in calculating. Now, for our formula for counting frequency, well, if all of these filters are flowing here and actually filtering this table down, all we have to do is count the number of rows. So I'm going to go back over to Data View. And in our fact table, this is the measure grid. It's a grid, and we have lots of measures here, right? So right below max quantity, I'm going to type something like frequency for quantity, colon, equal sign, and then we'll use the DAX formula, count rows. All we have to do is give it the table, FT tab, close parentheses. And those relationships in the data model will do its thing. When I hit Enter, of course, this is not in the pivot table looking at criteria, so it gives us all the rows in the table. Now, let's format this before we drop it into our pivot table. This is another awesome advantage of DAX formulas. We can add, in our case, number, whole number over here, and use the separator. This number formatting will follow this formula around wherever we drop it in however many pivot tables. Click OK. Now we can go back over to our Excel spreadsheet, and there's our pivot table. That cell right there is the one we were talking about. Let's see what number we get there. I'm going to open up F transactions, and down at the bottom, there's our f of x icon. That means that's a measure we can drag and drop into the values area. And look at that. There's the number formatting that followed this along. And there it is. Our answer is number of transactions that had a quantity amount between 13 and 24 in the year 2016, 25,627. Now, we want to add another condition or criteria. So we're going to go to Analyze, Filter Group, Insert Slicer. Over on All, there's our country. I'm going to check that. Click OK. I'm going to drag it, resize it, come up to Slicer Tools, Options, Columns, maybe 3. And here it is. That cell right there, well, that's all of them, 25,627. But what about just in Canada? So now that fact table is being filtered just for Canada, just for the year 2016, and just for quantities 13 to 24. Now 509, if we were actually to go look at the table, right? This is the fact table. It doesn't actually get filtered anywhere that we could see here in our data model. And of course, if we go over to diagram view, we're not going to see that filtering. But that is the beauty of DAX formulas. Filter, filter, filter. Really small table. Our count rows is counting. Now, I'm going to unfilter all of this. Let's go ahead and add some conditional formatting. Now, this is a pivot table. I'm going to click in a single cell instead of highlighting the inside of it. Go up to Home, Styles, Conditional Formatting, and I would like to do color scales. This will give us a color for the max and a color for the min, and there'll be some gradients in between. I'm going to click that first one right there, and there is a smart tag that pops up. I'm going to click the drop down, and instead of selected cells, or all cells showing frequency quantity, I want all cells showing our measure, but for count, categories, and years. That means whatever the row label is here and column label. I'm going to select all, and there it is. Now I want to go over to Canada. I could see there's the darkest blue. There's the darkest red. Biggest, smallest. And then the lighter ones in between. The lighter blue ones are near the middle. The lighter red ones are also near the middle. Now I'm going to highlight the pivot table, point to the edge, and with my move cursor, I'm going to click and drag. Now I'm going to highlight some cells, not inside the pivot table, though. Actually, I should have done that slightly differently. I'm going to try to highlight everything around, and then right-click Mini Toolbar. I'm going to select that color right there. Then I'm going to type a label here. Now watch this. I actually miscalculated where this pivot table should go. I'm going to highlight just the pivot table, holding Shift. I'm going to get my move cursor and click and drag down one. You can see that vertical bar. I'm going to let go of the mouse, but not Shift. In essence, I inserted it down, so I had a little row of blue there. Now I'm going to highlight all the way to H, Control-1 to open up Format Cells, Alignment. And under Horizontal, I'm going to say Center Across Selection. Click OK. Right-click, and I'm going to double-click the Format Painter. And then I'm going to click, 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 Escape to turn off the Format Painter. And I'm going to highlight those three cells and maybe change the font size to 14. Control-B to add some bold. One important thing, I need to right-click the pivot table options. And I want to say uncheck autofit column widths on update. Now I'm going to select Algeria, Australia, Brazil, and there is my frequency distribution for quantities by year and country. Hey, that was a lot of fun with a pivot table built on the data model. We did some conditional formatting, a slicer. We started off with building a table in Excel, learned a little bit about table formula nomenclature over here in Excel. Over here in the data model, we imported all of these tables, built an automatic calendar table, imported this one, built a special calculated column so we could build a relationship between our counting categories, built all of our relationships, and saw COUNTROWS function for doing frequency. All right, we'll see you next video.